Not long after David began serving in King Saul's court, Israel faced a new threat. The Philistines, their longtime enemies, gathered their armies for war. On one hill stood the Philistine forces, and on the other stood the army of Israel. Between them lay a valley, silent, tense, and waiting. Among the Philistines was a giant named Goliath, a warrior so tall and strong that his armor alone weighed more than most men could carry. Every morning and evening for 40 days Goliath stepped forward and shouted across the valley, mocking Israel's army and the God they served. "Send out a man to fight me. If he wins, we'll be your servants. But if I win, you will serve us." No one dared to move. Even the bravest of Israel's soldiers trembled at his voice. Meanwhile, David was back home in Bethlehem, tending his father's sheep. One day, Jesse, his father, asked him to take food to his brothers who were fighting in Saul's army. So David set out early in the morning, leaving his sheep with a keeper, and hurried to the front lines. When David arrived, he heard Goliath's booming challenge echo across the valley. The sight of the giant and the fear in the soldier's eyes stirred something deep inside him. Who is this man who dares to insult the armies of the living God? David's words soon reached King Saul. The young shepherd was brought before the king, and he declared, "Don't lose heart, my lord, I'll go and fight him." "You can't go against this Philistine. You're just a boy, and he's been a warrior all his life. When I was tending my father's sheep, lions and bears came to attack the flock. I went after them and struck them down. The same God who saved me from their claws will save me from this giant." Saul agreed and offered David his own armor. But it was too heavy. David tried walking in it, then shook his head. "I can't go in these." Instead, he picked up his shepherd's staff, chose 5 smooth stones from a nearby stream, placed them in his pouch, and held his sling in his hand. As David walked toward the battlefield, Goliath saw him coming and laughed. "Am I a dog that you come at me with a stick? Come here, boy. I'll feed your body to the birds and wild beasts. You come to me with sword and spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel whom you have defied. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. The whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. The battle belongs to the Lord." Then David ran toward the giant in one swift motion. He reached into his bag, pulled out a stone, and slung it through the air. The stone struck Goliath in the forehead and sank deep. The giant staggered and fell face down on the ground. David ran forward, drew Goliath's own sword, and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw their champion fall, panic seized them. They fled, and Israel's army surged forward with a mighty shout, chasing them all the way to the gates of their cities. That day David carried Goliath's sword and armor as trophies, not for pride, but as a reminder of what God had done. The shepherd boy now stood as Israel's champion, triumphant not by the strength of his arm, but by the power of his faith in God.